People have been fascinated by Viktor Frankl for decades, me included. In the United States, where I worked as a scientist for several years, his works were must-reads. The Library of Congress, the de facto National Library of the USA, lists his book, Man's Search for Meaning, as one of the 10 most influential books in history. Scientists and academics, commentators and artists, politicians and celebrities, as well as ordinary people, regularly mention his works as being some of the most important books that we should all read in our lives. I believe the same may be true of this book in the future. Viktor Frankl was one of the outstanding figures of the 20th century. Born in Vienna in 1905, he first obtained a doctorate in medicine and later neurology, becoming a professor at Vienna University with guest professorships at Harvard, among others, and made a lasting and multifaceted impression on almost the entire 20th century, far beyond the realm of medicine. In doing so, in his personal actions and creativity, he conquered the darker sides, as well as the less dark aspects of his century, as well as expounding on what was to become his life's work, the search for meaning, for what makes us truly human, the question of how freedom of spirit and of action can prevail even under extreme conditions, how free will and genuine dignity, including the responsibility that is bound up with them, even how a confrontation with suffering and with one's own mortality can be transcended to attain inner growth and meaning. Frankl describes us human beings as successful conquerors of transience, and as early as 1946 assigns to us a planetary responsibility. He was way ahead of his time, and today would most certainly be a popular talk show guest, social media star, or influencer. Viktor Frankl grew up as part of the Jewish community in Austria, and later lost almost his entire family in the Holocaust. When, as a result of the liberation, he finally returned to Vienna, after he had endured 4 different Nazi concentration camps, including Theresienstadt and Auschwitz, there was no longer anyone left to welcome him. All the people he loved had been gassed or tortured to death, including his wife, his parents, and his brother. Why go on living? As Frankl himself described, he decided at that point that he would not kill himself for the time being. At the very least, he wanted to reconstruct his first book, Ärztliche Seelsorge, The Doctor and the Soul, which he had written before the Second World War, and which was then published in 1946. In other words, he wanted to reevaluate the experiences he had lived through. This is how his highly influential work, Trotzdem ja zum Leben sagen, Man's Search for Meaning, subsequently came into being. This is different from the way the story is usually told, namely that he did not ask himself the big question about humankind's search for meaning until during his periods of incarceration in the concentration camps, and therefore that the most important work of his life was wrenched out of him by the horror he experienced. In fact, Frankl later confirmed that he had conceived all his ideas beforehand and had already written down much of the material. In this way, in his own words, he had made himself into a proof of concept. He was living proof. He saw his own suffering and his growth as a result of this suffering as confirmation of the hypotheses that he had developed before the Holocaust.